Well, if you'd like to turn back in your Bibles to page 1075, if you've got the church Bibles, that'll take you to James chapter 5 and verses 7 to 12, which is our passage for this evening. James chapter 5, page 1075 in the church Bibles. So imagine just for a moment that you work a full-time job and it's really hard work. For some of you, you don't have to imagine because that's just life. But imagine with me for a second. You work this job really hard, day in, day out for your boss. Perhaps the job involves physical manual labor and you come back home every day exhausted. And you don't enjoy this job at all, but you do it because you need the money. Maybe you're only just making enough each month to get by, perhaps support a family. And each month you only just have enough money to make it to the next payday. And by the time that comes around, there's nothing left in your bank. And this particular month, the end of the month rolls around, and sure enough, there's nothing left in your bank account, but it's payday. So you go to pick up your payslip to see how much money you've made this month. And you open the envelope and you look at it, and it says zero. Nothing. Your bosses have decided not to pay you this time, and there's nothing you can do about it. James is writing his letter to Christians, many of whom were living in poverty, and that is one of the things that they were having to endure. Their wages were not getting paid. And we read that in chapter 5, verse 4, which was part of the passage we looked at last week, where James, talking to the bosses, the employers, says, "The wages of the laborers who mowed your fields, which you kept back by fraud, cry out." So James's readers, the Christians he's writing to, were poor. They were having their wages kept back from them. They were being exploited. They were being taken advantage of. They were being oppressed. And now, in the passage we're going to look at this evening, at the start of verse 7, James turns to them and he says, "Therefore be patient, brothers and sisters." And this is our key word this evening, patience. But this passage it's about more than just being patient when you're waiting in line at the supermarket. This is about real patience. It's about being patient when patience is hard. This is about being patient when you have no money left and your employer has decided not to pay you this month. This is about being patient when you've been sick for months or years and nothing is improving. This is about being patient when the loneliness and the isolation has been so overwhelming for so long and it doesn't seem to be changing. It's about being patient when the abuse that you receive from your colleagues or your classmates has been going on and on and on and doesn't show any sign of stopping. This is about patience in those situations where the world would either just say, give up, or would give you some half-baked, empty promise that things will get better without really telling you how. So this subject of patience, then, is one that I hope each of us will be able to relate to in some way. It'll probably be relevant to each of us in slightly different ways, depending on our own experience. And as I said, James does have a specific situation in mind when he's writing this, but the principles that he talks about here, about being patient, about why Christians should be patient, about how we live patient lives, these are things that are important to all of us. And so tonight we're going to think about this subject of patience, and we're going to think of it under three main headings, all to do with time. So first of all, we'll think about patience for the future, about looking forward to the things that we're waiting for. Then we'll think about examples of patience from the past that James gives us, and how those examples can encourage us to be patient today. And then finally, we'll think about living patiently in the present, and what living patiently looks like. So patience for the future, examples of patience from the past, and living patiently in the present. So first of all then, patience for the future. What is it that James wants us to be waiting for, to be looking forward to? Well, he tells us, doesn't he? Verse 7, he says, "Be patient, brothers and sisters, until the coming of the Lord." So we're to be patient by looking forward to the coming of the Lord, of Jesus. Now, the Greek word here for coming is parousia, and that's a word that's used right across the New Testament. And it means coming, it means arrival, but usually in a personal sense. So it's about waiting for a person to arrive rather than waiting for an event to happen. So James wants us to be patient in our suffering because we're waiting for a person. We're waiting for Jesus. We're waiting for him to arrive, and our hope and our patience are focused on him. And then James gives us an illustration in verse 7, doesn't he, with this farmer. You'll see at the end of verse 7, he mentions the early and latter rain. That's a reference to the weather in Palestine at the time. So the farmers knew that there were 2 times in the year where the rain was most important. The first was in the autumn, just after the seeds had been sown, and then again in the spring, just before they harvested all the crops. And they knew that the rain at these 2 points in the year was essential if their crops were going to do well. So they would wait for it eagerly, patiently each year. The farmer works hard and he struggles to grow his crops, but he's waiting for the rain because he knows that is what his crops really need. He's waiting patiently for the rain. His hope is focused on that rain. And so it is to be with us. Our hope, our patience, is to be focused on Jesus. He is the object of our hope. He is what our hope, our patience are focused on, because he is the one ultimately who will come and fix things. And this hope for the future that James is showing us, it should give us strength here and now. So that's why James goes on to say in verse 8, be patient, establish your hearts. Now, other translations have strengthen your hearts or stand firm. But essentially, James is saying that we need to persevere. We need to keep going. And he tells us why again. He says, because the coming of the Lord is at hand. So keep working away in the fields like that farmer, not because you're trusting in your own work, not because you're trusting in your own efforts, but because the rain is coming. Keep pressing on, keep enduring, keep being patient through the trials you face, because the Lord is coming. Because Jesus is coming. Establish your hearts, stand firm, strengthen your hearts in the face of whatever trials you have to face, because Jesus is coming and he will put an end to them one day. And this hope that James is presenting us with, it's not vague, it's not a fairy tale. He is convinced that this is real, that it is going to happen. He is convinced that Jesus is going to come and make all things new, all things right. And the way that he will do that, James says, is through judgment. And if you were here last week when Connor was preaching to us, you would have seen that in verses 1 to 6, which we read earlier. In those verses, James talks about how Jesus is going to come to judge the oppressors, to put an end to their oppression, to put an end to their exploitation. And for those oppressors, James wants this judgment to be terrifying, because it is terrifying. But in our passage tonight, he's turning to the Christians, the ones who are being persecuted, and for them, he wants this judgment to be a source of hope. We are to be patient, we are to endure, because we know that Jesus is coming, and we know that he is coming in judgment. And this judgment is a good thing, because it is this judgment that puts an end to our suffering. It is the means, the mechanism by which Jesus ends our suffering. Jesus' judgment is the final liberation, the final thing that sets us free. He's already won the victory on the cross, of course. But when he comes again in judgment, he will bring about that final, ultimate destruction of sin and death to complete that victory, to finalize it forever. So James says, endure, keep going, be patient in your present trials, establish your heart, stand firm on the hope that you have in Jesus' coming, because one day he will come, and he will come in judgment, and that judgment will destroy the power of sin and death forever, permanently. So to those Christians who are being exploited by their rich employers who aren't paying them their wages, James says, be patient, because when Jesus comes in judgment, he will put a stop to what those people are doing to you. He will end it. And to us today, James says, be patient in whatever trials you have to face, because when Jesus comes in judgment, he will end them. Whatever it is that is causing you pain in the present, whether it is sickness, whether it is difficult circumstances, whether it is the direct results of other people's sin, Jesus will put an end to it when he comes in judgment. He will lock it up. He will destroy it. He will put an end to it so that it cannot hurt you anymore. And yes, that judgment is terrifying for those who are on the wrong side of it, absolutely. But for Jesus' people, It means release. It means freedom from the trials of this life and the final destruction of all the powers that would harm us. So when we're faced with those trials now, we can look forward to that future. We can look forward to Jesus' coming and to that coming judgment, and let that be the object of our hope. Let that be the thing we are hoping for. So that's the future in verses 7 and 8. Verse 9 we'll come back to later, but for now let's move on to verses 10 and 11 and think about the examples of patience from the past that James gives us. He gives us two examples, doesn't he? In verse 10, he talks about the prophets from the Old Testament, and then in verse 11, he talks about Job, also from the Old Testament. And these examples are meant to encourage us, because they show us that patience is possible, that it can be done. James is saying that you're not the first to go through this sort of thing. God's people have suffered in the past, and they will keep suffering into the future until he comes again. But however terrible your pain might be right now, others have suffered just as badly in the past. In many cases, worse, but God brought them through it. And not only did he bring them through it, but they were able to keep their faith. They were able to remain patient. And if they could do it, then so can you. Because at the end of the day, it doesn't matter how weak or strong you might be or you might feel compared to them, because you have the same God as them. And you have the same hope that they did, and that does not change. So these examples should encourage us. The first one then, in verse 10, is the prophets. James says that we should remember the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord as an example of suffering and patience. Now, we need to remember that James's readers were most likely Jews who had become Christians. So many of them would have been familiar with the stories of the prophets from the Old Testament. They would have known what James was referring to here. We don't have time tonight, obviously, to go through the entire Old Testament and every single prophet. So here are just a few very quick-fire examples just to get us thinking about the kind of things that James is referring to. So Jeremiah preached a message in Jerusalem that angered some of the powerful men in the city, so they hunted him down, they arrested him, they threw him in a pit, and they left him for dead. Daniel was thrown into the lion's den, and his friends were thrown into a furnace because they worshipped God and would not bow down to idols. Or Hosea. God told Hosea to marry a woman that he knew would be unfaithful to him because he wanted to use that as a sign for Israel. These prophets and many others like them suffered, and often it was for God's sake, either because the way they were living or what they were saying was offensive to people who were able to hurt them, or because God had given them a message to preach, a way to live that was particularly painful. But they persevered, and they waited patiently for God's judgment, because many of them were prophesying about God's coming judgment. And they waited for that, and they continued to trust, and they continued to be patient, and they continued to serve God. There were occasional blips, of course. Think of Jonah, who ran away from the job that God had given him, but even he came back in the end. We are not prophets, but we are called to be witnesses for the gospel. We are called to tell others about Jesus if we're Christians, to live lives that demonstrate our faith in God. And that can lead us into situations, into trials that we might not have faced otherwise. Serving God, proclaiming his word, living for him is a tremendous privilege for every Christian, but it can also be painful. It can also be difficult. But James wants to encourage us. He wants to encourage us with the example of the prophets because they continued to serve. They continued to serve God in the midst of their trials, sometimes imperfectly, almost always painfully, but they kept going. They were patient. They looked forward to the coming of the Lord, to the coming of his kingdom. And that hope is the same hope that we are to have. So if by God's grace they could endure and persevere, then so can you. If they could endure lions' dens and furnaces, if they could be beaten and left for dead and not lose hope, then we can endure whatever trials are sent our way because their God, the prophet's God, is our God too. And the hope that they had is the same hope that we have. So that's the prophets. The second example that James gives in verse 11 is the perseverance of Job. And again, we do not have time tonight to go through the entire book of Job, but let's just spend a bit of time thinking about what James says about Job. You'll notice that he talks about the end intended by the Lord, that the Lord is very compassionate and merciful. And those words intended by, you might notice if you've got the church Bible that they're in italics, which means they're not there in the original Greek text, but the translators have put them in because it reads better in English. And I think they're right to do that. I think that makes sense because the word for end in the Greek is telos, and that means a bit more than end. It means goal, it means objective. It's something you're aiming for, something you're working towards. So what James is saying then is that what happened at the end of the story of Job was God's plan, God's objective from the beginning. And James then tells us that that objective, that plan, was for God to show that he is very compassionate and merciful. Now, just in case you're unfamiliar with the story of Job, let me just give you a very brief outline of it. Job was a good man, an upright man, a righteous man, and he had a great life. He had a wife and 10 children. He had servants. He had thousands and thousands of livestock, which is another way of saying he was very rich. And he feared God. He was a godly man. But God sent terrible suffering into Job's life. And he lost his riches. He lost his health. He became sick. He lost his children. And then Job's friends came to him and they tried to make things better, but really only ended up making things worse. And in the end, God himself came to Job. And eventually God restored all of Job's health and his possessions, and he gave him a new family. Now, James is telling us that the point of that whole saga, that whole experience, was for God to show that he is very compassionate and merciful. And you might find that a bit difficult to swallow, because you might think that putting Job through all of that pain, all of that grief, wasn't compassionate and merciful at all. You might think it sounds cruel, even. Job's children were killed, and yet James is saying that this is somehow God's way of showing mercy. How can that be the case? And that is a very good question, and one that really would need a complete study of the book of Job to answer properly. So I'm just going to give one short answer for now, and that I'll have to do. And this answer mainly comes from Alec Mattia and his very helpful commentary on this passage. He points to the very last chapter in the book of Job, and one of the very last things that Job says, and he says it to God, and it's this. He says, "I had heard reports about you, but now my eyes have seen you." So before his experience, before all of his suffering, Job had heard about God. He knew things about God. He even feared God. But in his suffering, in his trials, he saw God for himself. Job's suffering gave him a more complete, more intimate, more profound knowledge of God that he wouldn't have gotten any other way. So God's strange, but ultimately merciful gift to Job through his suffering was that deeper, more profound knowledge of him. And Job didn't deserve this. Job did not deserve to know God more, because none of us deserves to know God more. But God granted him that knowledge out of mercy and compassion. And as Job came to know God more through his trials, through his suffering, his hope in the future and his assurance grew. And his suffering ultimately produced more patience, so that he was able to say in perhaps the most famous passage from the book of Job, in chapter 19, "I know that my Redeemer lives, and he shall stand at last on the earth. And after my skin is destroyed, this I know, that in my flesh I shall see God." Job's eyes were firmly fixed on his Redeemer who was coming. Job couldn't call him Jesus because he didn't know his name, but it is Jesus. He had the same hope that we have, the same hope that James is describing in our passage this evening. He endured, he persevered, he was patient because he was looking forward to the coming of his Redeemer, of Jesus. And he was able to do that. He was able to look forward because God was allowing him to do that. God was allowing him to know him more. Job suffered, but through that suffering, and because of God's mercy, he came to know God more closely. And because of that, because he had come to know God more closely, Job's hope for his coming Redeemer grew. And so ultimately, it was God's compassion, God's mercy that gave Job patience, that gave Job the power and the strength to endure. And this is really important. Patience is, as we've said, hard, very hard, and we will often fall short of the standard that James is setting for us in these verses. But God remains compassionate and merciful. We will often fall short of the example that is set by Job or the prophets, but God is still compassionate and merciful. We will fail to be patient. We will fail to keep going sometimes, but God's mercy and God's compassion are still there. He forgives us when we fall short, and he gives us more patience to keep going. So keep looking forward to the future. Keep looking forward to Jesus' coming, but also remember the examples of patience from the past given in God's word, because not only do these examples show us that patience is possible, that it can be done, they show us how it can be done. They show us that God is compassionate and merciful, and that compassion and mercy are what enable us to keep going. James sets a very high standard for us in these verses, and it's one we should be striving to live up to, but regardless of that, God remains compassionate and merciful. And he remains that way even in our trials and even in our failures. So that's the future and the past. Finally, then, let's think about living patiently in the present in verses 9 and 12. As I said, James is setting a very high standard in these verses, and that can seem a little bit harsh. Remember what James's readers were going through. They were being exploited. They were being taken advantage of. And then look at verse 9, where James says, do not grumble, stop complaining. Is that a bit harsh? Is that too much? Well, no, it's not. Because actually, this is exactly what James's readers need to hear. It's exactly what we need to hear, though we might not like it. The patience that James is encouraging here, the hope that he is setting before us, these are not just things that it's nice to have. They're not optional extras, they are essential. He isn't saying, well, here's one way of getting through your problems, but if you'd rather grumble and complain instead, that's okay. He's not saying that. He's saying that we need this. We need this God-given patience, this hope in Jesus. Because without it, our suffering will drive us into sin. And in verses 9 and 12, James highlights a couple of specific sins that our suffering can drive us into if we're not careful. In verse 9, he tells us not to grumble. And then in verse 12, he tells us not to swear oaths or make rash promises that we can't keep. Because if we don't fix our hope on Jesus and his coming, and if we don't remember God's mercy, then James says this is where we will end up. So, first of all then, verse 9, James says, do not grumble against one another. So remember, James's readers were poor, they were being cheated, they were suffering, times were really hard. And when times are hard, we do have a tendency to grumble and moan and complain and to turn against each other. But James's focus here is, unsurprisingly really, on Jesus. Right? He says, do not grumble, lest you be condemned. Behold, the judge is standing at the door. Jesus is the judge. He is the one who is coming to judge the world, and he is standing at the door. He can hear you. We are not to speak to one another in ways that we would be ashamed of if he were to walk into the room. Jesus can hear what you're saying. He knows what you're doing. He is listening. The judge knows. So do not grumble against each other, lest you be condemned. Lest you be condemned. What is James talking about there? What sort of condemnation is he talking about? You'll notice he says something very similar at the end of verse 12. He says, don't swear oaths, lest you fall into judgment. So is James saying that as Christians we can somehow lose our salvation if we complain too much? No, he's not. Remember verse 11, the Lord is very compassionate and merciful. And we know too, don't we, from elsewhere in Scripture that our salvation in Christ is secure, is fixed, and cannot be changed. Romans chapter 8, verse 1 says, "There is therefore now no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus." There is no condemnation. So if believers cannot lose their salvation, what is James talking about? What sort of judgment, what sort of condemnation is he talking about? Well, the Bible does teach that Christians, although we are definitely saved by Jesus' work on the cross, and that is fixed, that cannot be changed, but we will still face a form of judgment when Jesus comes again. This judgment is not to determine whether or not we're saved, because that is already decided. Instead, it is meant to test and evaluate the way we have lived, the way we have served in this life. And the main purpose of it is for God to reward us for the work we have done in his name, and to test that work. The Apostle Paul talks about this in 1 Corinthians chapter 3. He says, "Each one's work will become obvious, for the day will disclose it, because it will be revealed by fire. The fire will test the quality of each one's work. If anyone's work that he has built survives, he will receive a reward. If anyone's work is burned up, he will experience loss, but he himself will be saved, but only as through fire." When the Lord comes again, Christians will stand before him and be judged, and our works will be tested. And if we've grumbled, if we have not been patient, if we have allowed the strains and the suffering of this world to drive us to sin, then that will be exposed. And we will, as Paul says, experience loss, but our salvation will not be affected. On the other hand, if our works are good, if we have served faithfully, if we have served patiently, we will receive eternal reward. We are not saved by our works, not in the slightest, but our works do have an effect on the reward we receive in heaven. They do have eternal consequences. If we have grumbled, if we have sinned, that reward will be less. But that isn't to say that we will spend eternity feeling unsatisfied somehow, or feeling that we've missed out, because we'll be far too preoccupied with Jesus for that. But James is warning us that if we fail to live and speak patiently in this life, we will miss out on greater reward in heaven. So do not grumble, do not sin, lest you be condemned, lest you miss out on that eternal reward. Well, the last verse to think about tonight is verse 12, where James tells us not to swear. And just to be clear, this is not talking about using curse words or bad language or that kind of swearing. That's a separate issue, really. James here is talking about swearing oaths, making vows, making big promises. If we are impatient, if we lack patience, we might be more tempted to make big, rash promises, to overstep, to say too much, to overpromise, to swear that we will make something happen, to swear that we will put an end to our suffering and our trials because we're not prepared to wait for Jesus to come and do it for us. But James says, don't do that. Don't speak like that. But what exactly is he saying? Is this verse just saying that we should never, ever use the words, "I swear," and that's the end of it? Is he saying that we should never, ever make any sort of vow or promise ever? I don't think so, no. I don't think the Bible is against swearing oaths completely. But the Bible is very clear that swearing an oath, making a promise, is a very serious thing. And it is not to be done lightly. If you make a promise, if you make a vow, especially if you make a vow to God, and you don't keep it, you have sinned. This is what God says in Deuteronomy chapter 23. He says, "If you make a vow to the Lord your God, do not be slow to keep it, because he will require it of you, and it will be counted against you as sin." So there is a time and a place for making promises and making vows, but that's not what James is really talking about here. What he's talking about is using this kind of language on a regular basis, consistently, constantly, making promises that we can't keep, or maybe using God's name to back up what we're saying when we really don't need to, using inflated language, saying far more than we need to. because that is sin. Jesus himself says something very similar to James in the Sermon on the Mount. In Matthew chapter 5, he says, "Again you have heard that it was said to those of old, 'You shall not swear falsely, but shall perform your oaths to the Lord.' But I say to you, do not swear at all, neither by heaven, for it is God's throne, nor by earth, for it is his footstool, nor by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. Nor shall you swear by your head, because you cannot make one hair white or black. But let your yes be yes, and your no, no, for whatever is more than these is from the evil one." When you swear an oath, when you make a promise like this, what you're effectively doing is you're saying, I am going to make this thing happen. If it doesn't happen, that's on me. Right? You are assuming a position of responsibility and control. You're acting as if you really can make the thing you've promised happen. But Jesus says that that is nonsense. You can't even make one hair on your head white or black. You can't even stop yourself from going gray. Don't pretend to control things that you cannot control. God can control these things. God can control everything. Of course he can. We can't. And when we make rash promises, when we step too far, we are putting ourselves in the place of God, effectively, which is a very serious sin indeed. But both James and Jesus say that we shouldn't need to do this. We shouldn't need to make these big promises, these grand gestures, because our yes should be yes and our no should be no. So we should be people of integrity. People should be able to trust what we say without us needing to resort to grand gestures or big promises. Impatience, lacking patience in the midst of difficult times can lead to us overreaching and saying things that we don't need to say and implying that we can control things that we can't control. But God is in control. And if we're being patient, if we're trusting in him, if we're remembering his mercy, if we're looking forward to that day when Jesus comes to fix everything, we should be content simply to let our yes be yes and our no be no. We can leave the big promises to God, who can actually control things. We just need to focus on being honest and truthful. Because this is what patience looks like. If we are patient, if we are trusting in God, if we are fixing our hope on Jesus' coming, if he is the object of our hope, then we won't be people who grumble. We won't be people who overpromise or say more than we need to. These things are sins, and James warns us that they have serious consequences. But he also reminds us that the Lord is compassionate and merciful. So please do not walk away from this sermon this evening thinking that if you've ever complained about something or made a promise that you couldn't keep, that you're a lost cause and you might as well give up, because God is compassionate and merciful. At the same time, do not walk away thinking that if you are a Christian and if you are saved, then patience doesn't really matter because God is compassionate and merciful. James warns that our actions have consequences. There is a judgment for believers as well, and unaddressed sins do have consequences. Instead, there's a middle ground. And I think the illustration back in verse 7 of the farmer really sums it up quite well. The farmer works hard to make his crops grow, and we need to work hard to be patient. Being patient is not easy. Living a patient life is not easy. If the farmer doesn't work, if he doesn't put the work in, his crops don't do as well. His harvest is less plentiful. If we fail consistently to be patient, if we keep allowing our pain to drive us into sin, then our harvest will be less plentiful. We will miss out on some of that eternal reward, even though we will still be saved. But the farmer isn't depending on his own work. He's waiting for the rain. That's what he's hoping for. That's what his mind is fixed on, because he knows that is what he needs. That is what he's dependent on. So we, too, are not to be dependent on our works, because they don't save us. Our works do not save us. Jesus saves us. His mercy saves us. Our hope should be fixed on him and on his coming. So we should persevere, and we should endure, and we should continue to serve God in the midst of our trials. because we know that the Lord is coming. And when he does come, he will come in judgment to end our trials, to end our suffering, to make all things new. So Jesus is the object of our hope. He is the thing we are hoping for, the thing we are looking forward to. He is our reason to be patient. And it is God's mercy and God's compassion that gives us the power to be patient, gives us the strength to be patient. And we have the examples from Scripture to prove it. The Lord will come to make all things new, to put an end to all of our trials and suffering. So in the meantime, until that happens, as James says, be patient, brothers and sisters, until the coming of the Lord. Amen.